Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for Being Libertarian LLC, which includes BeingLibertarian.com, Think-Liberty.com, and RationalStandard.com. You know our social media, you know our podcast feed, you know you can follow me directly on Facebook just by searching Killian Hobbs-author. So I'm going to skip past all that and hop right to it. So I wanted to start the episode off just by touching on a little bit of recent news. Just a few days ago, as you know, John Bolton was quite thankfully relieved of his position as National Security Advisor. They cited some disagreements with Trump, etc., but it's one less warmongering, hawkish neocon haunting the White House. So I'm pretty sure we can all take that as a win, at least anybody that's likely to tune into the program here. Also, it was the observation just on Wednesday about 9/11. I had a piece on Think Liberty yesterday called The War Against the War on Terror. It was part of my Bad Arguments series where I went against the entire concept of the war on terror and all the damage that it's caused and all of the just problems that we've seen with it. I could go into the details, but it's better to read through it because I've got all the different cited sources and everything else listed there. For today's episode, though, I didn't want to talk about war or anything like that, or not necessarily war at least, but I kind of wanted to talk about how we got to where we are. What I mean here is take a look at the development of our history over the last, couple of decades even. When you take a look at how consistent things had been, sure, there was different cultural changes, but some of the just straight economic changes or actual governmental changes, the types of influence and frameworks that we have that define our lives, we've had massive amounts of change, and yet next to no public recollection or acknowledgement of this. I mean, a great example that I could list here would be the cost of computers, let's say. Some of the original electronics, you pull up old advertisement from the 80s, and it'll tell you about computers that cost, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And you have to realize that's in nominal dollars. I mean, $4,000 then would have been the equivalent of about $20,000 now, just when you convert the nominal dollars over. And that was, it was okay to spend that much money. Now, there's a couple things that could explain that kind of differentiation. One example would be, markets being a little bit freer at the time. Another example for that could easily just be following the Austrian business cycle and seeing the way that things kind of rotate and fluctuate, and then seeing the way that the U.S. government reacted once we got into the 90s with the Clintons and then the Bush era, Obama era, et cetera, and kind of seeing the degree to which the government tried to interfere with the finance sectors or try to control the currency a little bit more. But there's so many other changes that I think are really worth noting here. Another great example would be universities. The fact that we've got colleges and universities where it's stopped being something special. Having a college degree now is realistically not all that different than having completed your high school 30 years ago. And it's not the great distinguisher in a job field as it used to be. It's considered a basic rubber stamp to apply for certain types of jobs, and most of them are still entry-level positions because you still need to get the experience that goes with it. We can also, take a look at the housing market, take a look at a bunch of this stuff. I want to try to, and I'll touch on some of the other examples as we go along as well, but I wanted to try to kind of map out what happened and the things that we've come to accept that it has allowed all of this to happen to get us to where we are now. So a couple of things that I wanted to cite here. I'll start off with what I think is probably the biggest one, which is that we've offloaded our costs to our future selves. That's right. What I'm referring to here is the crediting system that the entirety of the West has become addicted to. It's easy to see the areas that this has impacted us just by tracking what things have had their costs increase versus what things have had their costs decrease. Now, credit's only one part of it. Government interference in the markets and some of the regulatory fees and different restrictions on trade, so on and so forth, are also vast contributing factors. But I mean, you take a look at, let's say, healthcare. The reason we have in a supposedly free market like the U.S. has, I mean, it's not like Canada up here where we socialized our healthcare, have a single payer system, and it's all done through, well, not all of it. There are some things that still cost money up here, but the bulk of it is done through taxation. Even when we look at that, you'd think that the U.S. model would be cheaper, would have an average cheaper per person per year cost than countries that have socialized their medicine. You would say, okay, there's different companies, there's competition, there's a reason for prices to be driven down. Why is it that the prices are so much higher? I mean, the average Canadian household, based on median income, et cetera, average Canadian household will spend somewhere around the area of about $11,000 per year in taxes in order to cover the costs of healthcare. Now, whether they actually use the services or not in a given year is another question and part of the problem with the single payer system, but it works out to about, I think it's about $11,000. So translate that over to US, probably about $8,000 or $9,000, just depending on the fluctuation of the dollar at the time. In the US, though, the average expenses are pretty much the same. Last I checked, the average U.S. household expenditure, and you can correct me in the comments of whatever post that you happen to find this on, whether it's on my author page or if you see this on Think Liberty there, or maybe even if you see a post on Being Libertarian. You can try to correct me here if you've got a more accurate number, but I do believe at the last check it's about $10,000 or so is the average U.S. expense on healthcare. So why is it that in a free market, healthcare isn't cheaper? Well, to start, it's not a free market because of the FDA and because of all of the restrictions that you guys have on your medical trades. There's a lot that holds back market signals that allows there to be a competition on this. You don't see it where people are, actually in a situation where they can kind of field their options between different hospitals to find the most cost-effective treatment. Sometimes people have the ability to do that, but most of the time, especially because it's healthcare, people aim for the best quality. Now, that's a good thing. That's the market in play. But when we look at the actual cost of it, a good reason for it is the health insurance that we have. Now, even though there's competing health insurance in the United States, and not everybody has health insurance, which is part of why the costs of it are so bloody high and why that's such a detrimental thing in the United States, the reason that you see these kind of cost increases has a lot to do with the fact that you're not actually paying for it 9 times out of 10 up front. You might get hit with a, $100,000 hospital bill, sure. And when you're looking at that number, it's a horrific number, but then you think of the types of health insurance that people have and what's covered, what's not. $100,000, if it's covered by something that you pay into on a monthly basis, you're not going to really notice it the same way that you would if you were actually just immediately put on the spot for $100,000 and, driven into debt or driven into collections and your entire financial crediting history destroyed because you happen to get sick. Because of the existence of health insurance in the United States and because a lot of those costs aren't covered by the individual up front, they're covered over time or they're covered through some form of insurance purchase that they have that they pay their monthly premiums on, it's not a cost that we directly pay. So because the people do not directly pay for it in the same sense as if you were actually just handed the entire bill and you had to tackle it yourself, there's no incentive for people to try to fight against the cost because they can just go for the best service. I mean, we see this with the way that the government spends our money. The way the government spends our money, they spend it like it's not their money, because it's not. All of the money that the government has, they have because of the money they've taken from us, the people. Insurance companies and hospitals are very similar in that regard. They can charge what they charge because they know that the average person doesn't have to hand over $100,000. Their insurer has to hand over $100,000. So because that just keeps upping the numbers and upping the numbers, and on the insurance company side, medical bills, they go from $50,000 to $100,000 over a period of time where the cost of it just increases. And they say, well, that's perfectly fine. We'll just charge a little bit more each month and we'll make back the difference. And we'll still be profitable, if not more profitable than we've ever been with these increased prices. So by all means, charge us that. So when we look at the monthly costs of these things and we try to break it down because it's ameliorated over time like that, we're not really stuck with the cost, so we don't end up caring to the degree that we should. The only time that it becomes a major problem, and this is the biggest critique of the medical system in the United States, is when someone doesn't have that kind of health insurance and the costs are artificially raised because it's massive corporations buying off of hospitals rather than people paying for it. It creates that inflated cost that we as regular people aren't truly able to handle unless we've already signed off with one of these companies to take from us month after month after month our hard-earned income in order to cover these things at these inflated prices. We see the same thing with the housing market. I mean, we all know the story, Grandpa was able to buy a house for, 6 months' pay, and he was done, covered, and owned a place, and now it's worth a bunch of money. So you see the increase in the middle class and a whole bunch of people sitting on asset wealth that basically came out of nowhere because of just the market signals on housing. The reason for this, though, again, is very similar. When we switched away from the idea of people needing cash or needing limited loans in order to be able to cover these things, we switched over to today's system where it's all mortgaging. It's all mortgaging on 25, 35, 40-year mortgages and down payments as low as maybe 5%, in which case you do that and all of a sudden you're a homeowner. You have a house worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars depending. Now, the housing market's completely different in Canada than it is in the United States. I know in the United States you can end up getting a house that's worth, $200,000-$300,000, maybe $400,000, and it's a very nice house. Up here, even when you take the dollar difference into consideration, to get an okay house up here, depending on where you're living, if you're near any of the cities, not even in the city, but just near it or in the travel space for it, you're looking at $700,000, $800,000. I've seen cookie cutter houses that have been put together, by those companies that do the massive developments. I've seen cookie cutter houses that have gone for $1 million just because this is the area that they're in, and people keep flipping them and getting a bit more profit and flipping them and getting a bit more profit. Now, about 30% of the housing costs, at least in Canada, again, I'm sure it's different in the United States, about 30% of it is just fees. Almost 30% of the cost of our housing up here is fees. Just government costs that are stipulated and forced onto the buying price for these houses. That said, though, even if we were to remove that, it wouldn't remove the inflated value of the houses. It just means that more wealth would transfer between the hands that own the houses at this point, because you take that cost off, it's not like people are going to start devaluing their own houses at that point. Real estate agents certainly aren't going to do it, and property owners certainly aren't going to do that either. But because we've become so addicted to the idea of crediting, we've just been able to say, okay, yeah, you know what? House costs, $600,000. I might be able to turn it into $8. Sure, I'll just pay whatever it is that you tell me that I need to pay for the house. Put it on a mortgage, mortgage now. $200-$300 more a month. Okay, that's fine. We'll just go ahead and take that because we only see it in the monthly. Almost $1 million for a house is a massive quantity of money, but the way that it's looked at is, the monthly, it's not too bad. So I'm not going to fight that pricing and say that that's ridiculous. The result of this, especially up here, it's a little different up here because we have a large amount of restrictions on our immigration. Everybody thinks that Canada is this like big, nice, open door mosaic where everyone's free to come and go as they please. But in reality, the United States is far more open with its immigration policies than Canada is. I mean, you guys would absolutely lose it if you guys had the same kind of laws that just came down the pipeline and were implemented the same as us up here. Anyone that is even slightly towards open borders or towards, deregulating immigration in the United States, if you saw the stuff that was coming that we do up here, I think even conservatives in the United States would kind of say, well, wait a minute, let's slow it down a little here. But up here, we end up where we limit the kind of people that can come in, and the people that do come over end up coming over with large amounts of money because they need to have some form of provable assets to bring over. So people are coming over with the kind of money where they can afford these prices for housing, and they're okay with it because A, they're not used to or knowledgeable on our markets, and B, it's pretty much a requirement of existence that they take on some of the kind of price points that we have in here so that they can set themselves up in the country. Now they'll work, husband and wife will work, 60 hours a week each in order to, fight and scrape just to make sure that they can do that. And then eventually flip the housing over in order to make some kind of a profit on it or to have money towards the next house so the mortgage isn't as painful. And these are things we can do as well, but that's a side point to the point I'm trying to make here. Because we do it all through our accrediting system and because we look at the monthly rather than the total, you don't have people really fighting back against the total. I mean, a perfect example of this is the cost of post-secondary education, colleges and universities. Now, everyone says, it's just professors being greedy, it's schools being greedy, so on and so forth. And to a degree, they're right. Part of the greed that's included in there, though, is the way that the market signals get screwed up because of the existence of government loans, government grants, just free pass scholarships, don't have to pay us back sort of thing. And even just bank loans that are specifically designed for as student loans. When we look at those, again, you're looking at, a couple $100 a month to try to pay something off. If you're not the one paying for it in that sense, if the mentality is, I have to worry about paying, $300 a month towards this rather than thinking, okay, I have to pay $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000. I think I've seen totals as ridiculous as like $250,000 towards an education. If those are the kinds of numbers that you're working with, and those are the types of loans that you take out, and that's what you have to fight against, most people, if they had to pay out of pocket for an education today, wouldn't. Most people would just try to find factory work, try to find regular service jobs, something of that nature, rather than hopping in for college or university, because with the price point, it just would not be worth it. Now, again, government interference, we see the changes in policies on the markets, on how they work, on what schools are allowed to do, on what we can do when we're interacting with schools as far as our price points are concerned. I mean, you can't really negotiate tuition like you could with some other businesses. And again, with that said, the key aspect, though, is our mentality as the consumer. And that's really what it comes down to. Because we've allowed ourselves to become so addicted to the idea of credit, where we say, okay, you know what? I can't afford this at this price, but I can afford this a month, so I'll go ahead and agree to that price anyway. If people agree to a price, I mean, this is Econ 101. If people agree to a price, that starts to become the normal price for something. So if college, for example, costs a couple thousand dollars for, a single semester, if college costs that and a person had to shell that money out of their own pocket, chances are they would simply say, no, I'm not paying that because I can't afford it. I'll just go ahead and continue doing what I was doing. But since we've got this credit system in place, people don't look at that and they start saying, okay, $50,000 for a degree is an acceptable amount of money because it works out that I'm only paying this much per month in order to pay it off. I can live with that. In which case the schools will more than happily say, that sounds great. We'll take that money. Okay, this is tuition now. And then 2 years down the road, they say, all right, now we're going to try for this little bit extra, this little bit extra, this little bit extra. It's why we see that it's gone so far beyond the regular curve for pricing versus inflation. There is if you look at the way that inflation has worked over time and how our dollar values have changed, almost every type of consumer good that is available on the free market, even with all of the different interferences that we see from the government, almost every single one of them has declined sharply in price. Food has gone down. Cars have gone down. Consumer electronics in general have gone down. Books, movies, all of these sort of things have gone way down in price. Some things, you look at like a movie theater and the costs of things there, but once you take nominal dollars into consideration, it's not that much more expensive than it used to be. Paying, 25 cents for something sounds like, oh yeah, that's like, that was back when it was a realistic price. 25 cents for a movie in the 1950s. Yeah, you're paying like $5-10 today. That's just normal inflation at that point, which is why inflation of the dollar is almost as bad as taxation on the dollar because it literally robs the value out of your own savings. But that's a rant for another episode. The things that we rely on credit for are the ones where the prices have increased beyond the regular rate of inflation. And they're the most important things that we need to come up with money for. Our healthcare, our education, and a place to live. Now, increases in property tax doesn't help with that. Increased regulations on what healthcare providers can do and what insurance companies can do, that doesn't help out with it. The key issue, though, like with all of these things, ultimately comes down to us as the consumer and us as the citizen. And this is something that gets missed in a lot of libertarian rhetoric when we talk about all the ills of the government. All of the changes that the government makes, all of the restrictions they put in, all of the just general interference into the markets, into our free exchange with other companies and other people, and realistically just into our wallets. All of the things that they do because they think they can get away with it. And the problem is that we continuously allow ourselves to let them do it. And I find this might sound a little forced or a little strained here, a bit of a stretch, but I find that it comes to the same kind of mentality as the crediting issue. We see it as something where it's somebody else's problem. Like credit, we don't see as upfront our problem because we don't have to pay, $100,000 for our health care. Our insurance company has to pay it. We just have to pay this small portion. Same thing with education. We don't have to pay these massive tuitions. The bank has to pay it, or the government has to pay it with the loans. We just have to work on paying that amount back over time, and the education we get will hopefully give us a job where we might actually be able to do that. Realistically, outside of being a lawyer or being a doctor, it's very unlikely that you'll actually make enough money back to properly pay those off unless you have a great plan for it right up front. But most people don't. So that's why you end up with stories where people have gotten student loans and paid, $30,000 towards it and still had basically the same amount left over because of the interest rates that they agreed to. Now, with that said, the same mentality comes to it when we look at our government itself. They do all these things because they think they can get away with it. And every time that the general public lets them get away with it, the threshold increases. Similar to the market where the prices increase because we let credit deal with everything, the government increases what it's willing to do to us. And not do for us, do to us. It increases the threshold of what they're willing to do to us because we offload our political responsibilities to, opposition politicians that we hope to get elected. And all we have to do is vote once every 4 years. It's that mentality of offloading this responsibility that I think is ultimately the core issue that's led to the kind of rapid expanse of these issues. Housing has become a crisis. The healthcare costs have become a crisis. The cost of education and the barriers in the workforce for people to actually become employed to start paying these things off, or even just to keep up with the costs of everything else that are naturally rising through, just regular commerce. All of those things happen because we are willing to offload our responsibilities for them. We don't fight back in the market. We don't, vote with our wallet in that sense. We don't actually put up a stink when there's another interference in our rights when it comes to how certain things are regulated or certain prices are adjusted, or when the Fed makes any kind of adjustments for things like subprime mortgage rates or inflation in general or anything like that. The short way to put it is that we don't put up enough of a stink about it. That's really the easiest way to put it. We offload the responsibility, and it's whenever we offload the responsibility that market signals get muted. And when I say market signals, I'm not talking, again, just purely economic here, but the concept of market signals are pretty static no matter what you apply them to. The government will get away with what it thinks it can get away with unless we signal to them that we will not allow it. The problem is we do. And the more that we allow it, the further that they encroach. Going back to, the Patriot Act, perfect prime example. A whole bunch of people put up a bit of a stink about that coming out, but no one really fought back against it. It passed through Congress. It started getting implemented. Nobody rioted. Nobody threw up massive protests. Nobody fought back against the clear and blatant violation of people's rights that were included in that. And now we have it where those same rights are getting violated at executive orders. They don't even need to pass an act at this point. Like Obama famously said, I got a phone and I got a pen. And that's the mentality for it now. Nobody really fights back unless it's the opposition party that's doing it, in which case they really just fight back against the opposition party, and it turns into a bunch of squabbling about nothing while the government continues to write off and do what they please. What we need to do as people is we need to stop passing the buck on to our future selves. Whenever we do things through crediting, that's us passing the buck on to the future selves. Don't get me wrong, there's a place for credit. There's a place for loans and different things like that. Like if you're trying to start up a business, no, you probably won't have the kind of money required for a startup fee sitting around waiting for you. But that's a full-on proper investment at that point. That's something where you know exactly the costs that are going into it and exactly what your payoffs are going to be and everything else that's included. That is a calculated decision based on a certain period of time that you have actually planned out. When it comes to all of the other things that we rely on credit for, we don't have that kind of planning. We just have a hole that we've dug ourselves into. And a lot of the things, especially, for starting a business, a lot of those things are still under regular consumer components. It's just that a person starting a business has to buy a lot of them. That's really the key difference between the two is, you have to rent out space. Well, people have to rent spaces all the time. You need, computer, you need printers, you need office supply, phone lines, all that sort of stuff. People need to buy that stuff anyway. In which case, having to take a loan out for it, it's not going to impact the pricing of starting a business in that sense, because a lot of those business costs are already dealt with through the competition of B2B sales in general. So in that case, the credit system doesn't come into play because people can still purchase these things without needing those loans to survive on. A lot of the other things we have, we just end up relying on them. We end up relying on our future selves to be able to pay off what we're choosing to do today. And as I've already said, we make the same mistakes with our government, which is how they get away with the things we do. We rely on some future government to come down and fix everything for us. I mean, libertarians actually think that at some point in the not too distant future, we'll elect some kind of libertarian president that's going to come in and undo all of the damage. And it's not going to work out that way. For what's required to repeal this system, the way that we need to be able to fix this system and undo the damage that we've allowed to have happen, it's going to take time. And it's not something that we can pass on to our future selves. It's something that we need to do ourselves starting now and continuing through it. People need to start fighting back against some of the medical costs. People need to start fighting back against tuition costs. I mean, teachers go on strike often enough. Why don't students? Students should start striking against some of the schools for the costs of tuition and the price points that come out, and being able to say, no, what you are offering is not worth this. People need to be willing to turn away from that and say to themselves, I'm going to go into a different field. I'm going to get into a trade or something like that, where you can still make the same, if not in many cases, better money without having to perpetuate that system. With the housing market, I mean, the tiny house movement's a great example of that, but why people aren't fighting back against some of the governments that have started to ban the use of like tiny houses in certain states, or some of the extra restrictions that are on it, or some of the massive amounts of property taxes. The fact that people are not fighting back against these things means that they're not putting the signals out there to say that this is not okay. They'll complain about it over a beer or over a coffee, sitting around with people, or they'll post on Facebook and scream into the void, but they're not going to do anything about it themselves. They don't actually actively choose the way that they participate in the markets today and now, and do so in a way that could help undo this damage that is doing nothing more than accumulating at a faster and faster rate. So hopefully when you think of these different things, it'll give you a bit of an idea of some of the problems we face, like some of the sources for it, and where you can go and the things that you can do to not participate in it and further that damage. Try to find ways to, mitigate some of the medical costs. Try to find ways to get an education and go through that without perpetuating the current price gouging. Not to be confused with the economic term of price gouging, but that's, again, another story for another day. The excessive predatory pricing in healthcare, in housing, in anything that the government and credit systems touch, and just the predatory nature of the government itself. The less that we do now, the more we have to pay for it in the future. And the whole problem, again, is the fact that we keep passing the buck to them until the future selves aren't going to be able to handle it. So, again, thank you to everybody that's out there listening to the episode today. I hope you enjoyed everything that I went through here. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or anything like that, you can just send me a message at the Facebook page there, Killian Hobbs-author. Otherwise, our social media feeds, our other podcasts, our websites and all the different ones you can check in daily for all the new content that comes out there. Otherwise, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.